Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. If you were listening to the latest episode of our sister pod, Curse of Politics, this week, it was during the last third of the show when I breathlessly teased who was coming on this episode of the Herle Burly. I did that for two reasons. One of which is I'm the boss of both shows and I do what I want when it comes to crossover marketing. And two, I'm genuinely excited to have this man on the show for a conversation that's both of the moment and critical. Naheed Nenshi, leader of the Alberta NDP, is here. And full disclosure, when I touted Mr. Nenshi's upcoming appearance, I also issued an invitation for Premier Smith to come on the show. No response so far, but I'm hopeful. Anyway, you Herle Burly-ites are all engaged Canadians. You know all about Mr. Nenshi and his powerful political brand. Former three-term Mayor of Calgary. Named Best Mayor in the World in 2014. Winner of the Alberta NDP Leadership on the first ballot about a year ago with over 86% of the vote. Impresses some people, but not me. Got 93 with Martin in 2003. He upped that to almost 90% in a leadership review just last weekend at the party's annual convention. So today we'll talk about him, his background, his decision to join the NDP, and then the issues du jour. Western alienation, Alberta separatism, and legitimate Alberta grievances about oil and gas and other things. And also, importantly, what exactly is his argument to replace Premier Smith? Naheed, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Thanks for being here, man.
Well, thanks so much, David. I'm smiling because I'm in Winnipeg at the beautiful Fort Garry Hotel, and I love finding a background that looks like a virtual background. So those watching on video, that is really what it looks like behind me. But David, I'm very upset about this 93% business that you just raised.
Yeah.
Because I've been under the impression that I had the largest number of votes of any provincial political candidate on the first ballot in history. Though I will tell you that there was a guy who was running federally recently, and I might have sent him a text on the night of his huge victory where I said 86.1 is greater than 85.9.
Yeah. Well, I told him I wasn't impressed either with his number. Of course, neither of you got to run against Sheila Copps, but that's a different matter altogether.
I won't tell you that my very, very, very first foray into political life when I was quite a young man might have been on the floor of that particular convention, and I might have been wearing a Sheila Copps t-shirt.
Really?
That is actually
When did your
true.
political judgment improve?
Immediately after that convention. No, I stayed close to her for many years, but it is a true story that the person who became my best friend, who was my chief of staff for many years, who continues to work with me a little bit with the Alberta New Democrats, we met and someone said, you should volunteer on a campaign. And that was the campaign that was available. And we've been friends and political co-conspirators ever since.
Cool. You're talking about Chima?
That's right.
Excellent. I know him a little bit. He's a great guy. And I don't
sure
hold
is.
that against him. And I don't hold it against you. It was a long time ago. We won. Bygones are bygones. It's all good. Listen, I want to talk about you, not me. I want to talk about you. So
refreshing.
Yeah, let's kind of start at the beginning. As I understand from Wikipedia, you're born in Ontario but moved almost immediately to Calgary.
Yes, right? I did my research, created my briefing book, and convinced my parents that the future was in the West. So I moved to Calgary when I was about 18 months old, and I grew up there.
Right. What was that like?
It was terrific. We grew up in a working class part of Calgary, in the community of Marlborough, and we struggled a lot. I always say that sometimes we were poor and sometimes we were very poor. But we lived in a community that invested in everyone, that wanted everyone to succeed. So I availed myself of outstanding public education. I haunted the public library. I learned to swim badly at a public pool. I explored the city on public transit. And it just reminded me that, my life's work is to make sure that every kid growing up in Marlborough or anywhere still has access to thrive, still has access to great opportunities. And that is my very simple political philosophy. that everyone should be able to thrive. And in order for people to thrive, we need a community that invests in them.
I feel compelled to ask you this. I grew up in Regina, a decade before you, and I know that things changed in a decade. Um, and I know Calgary's bigger and a little ahead of Regina in terms of urbanization. But I saw my first brown person in school in grade 9,
Yeah, you were a little late. Yeah.
right? Um, I don't suspect it was common in Calgary even in the 80s. What
Well,
was it like growing up? What was it like growing up
certainly
that way
much,
in Calgary?
yeah, certainly much less common than today. But it's always been sort of a vibrant place. And the neighborhood I grew up in, very typical of the time before we had, and this always confused a guy called Jason Kenney who thinks he understands minority communities in the country and never really did. But in those days, there weren't sort of suburbs that were entirely one thing or another thing. And so what you ended up doing was lumping together working class people, white people, indigenous people, people from different backgrounds. And when I was about, I would say 7 or 8 years old, we welcomed into my neighborhood a very large number of people who had a very different background. And at that time, we called them boat people from
Right.
Vietnam.
Yep. Yep.
And to this day, Calgary's national dish is the banh mi, the Vietnamese sub. And you can find pho places on every corner. And, it was a challenge. A lot of these folks had been through a lot of trauma. Their English skills were maybe not great. You see, my family was always really lucky because we came from Tanzania, an English colony. My parents went to English schools, so although they spoke with a bit of an accent and were a bit shy about it, we always spoke English. And that really made a huge difference. But these folks didn't. They'd been through a lot worse than we'd been through. And so I got to see sort of in real life, what does it look like to try and create a truly pluralistic and diverse place? So I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to say that it was utopian, that there was no racism on the streets or anything like that. But ultimately, I think most people just wanted other people to do well. And one thing that shocks me about the world right now is the level of casual racism that we see online and in the community, particularly how people are talking about South Asian folks right now, is even worse than it was in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I know why that is. And it is because for the last, and this will be no surprise to you or anyone who pays attention to this podcast, but for the last decade or so, we have had a very calculated move by politicians, mostly on the right, but across the spectrum, to move to an increasingly atomized kind of politics. If we can get a base super excited about us and voting at very high numbers, then we no longer have to appeal to everyone. So it used to be that and you know this very well, every single election night, you would hear a victory speech, and the victor would say, and to those who didn't vote for me, I pledge to be the best premier, mayor, prime minister
Yep.
for you, and I'm going to earn your vote the next time. You almost never hear that anymore
Premier Carney,
because
Prime
it's
Minister
not
Carney
people.
said that.
He did, and you know who else did? Premier Smith when
Right.
she won. She didn't mean it. But you don't hear it as much anymore because of this kind of politics of division and anger and divisiveness. But once you start that, it's very hard to stop it. Once you give people permission to be divisive, there was a guy called Jason Kenney. Maybe you've heard of him. He was in federal politics for a while and then tried out provincial politics and was not very successful. But towards the end of his premiership, he used to really bemoan, and he still does, quite angrily what had happened to his movement. And
Mhm.
he said, quote, the lunatics have taken over the asylum, unquote. And I used to say to him, well, let's change that analogy a little bit because Jason, the arsonist, the one who lit the match, is not allowed to call the fire department. And so I see a lot of that happening. And I see a lot of that happening in Alberta, but across the country. And it's deeply troubling to me. This politics of division is threatening to undo so much of what we built together as a nation.
So, elections. As you know, we just finished one. Boiling down all the promises, all the policy statements, the two regular intrusions of 51st state blather, it means Canada has chosen its future, until the next election anyway. Our presenting sponsor, Telus, has done the same, by which I mean made some pretty thoughtful choices about the future. In a phrase, they're going to play a pivotal role in making it more connected, efficient, and sustainable. In a shorter phrase, they're helping make it more friendly. A noble goal, if ever I've heard of one. So here's a brief glimpse of Telus's more friendly future. In just a couple of months, they'll launch Canada's leading sovereign AI factory, powered by NVIDIA, driving innovation in ethical, sustainable AI applications. Telus is also at the forefront of using generative AI to make customer service more accurate and efficient. Their continuing investments in 5G are going to speed the development of autonomous vehicles, smart cities, and advanced Internet of Things applications. TELUS Health is forever innovating and expanding digital health technology, transformative stuff that broadens access to services and improves preventative care. And as a company named one of the world's most sustainable by Time magazine, ranking 21st out of 500 on their inaugural list, that work only moves forward with eco-friendly technology like smart agriculture and energy-efficient networks. The future is a big place, Herle Burly-ites. I haven't even mentioned Telus's massive investments in advanced cybersecurity and data protection, or how they continue to work to bridge the digital divide so all Canadians have access to high-speed internet and digital literacy programs. Advancing technology to make people's lives better. It's what's defined TELUS as a national brand for the past 25 years, building on their 125-year legacy in Western Canada. It's what their future will be. Pretty friendly, I'd say. So do you think this new United Conservative Party is a more negative force than its predecessor, the PC Party of Alberta, was?
Oh, there's absolutely no question. So we had the same government in place for 44 years. I always remembered it because the Peter Lougheed Conservatives won the year before I was born. So I would just take my age and add 1 year for how long we had Conservatives. But prior to that, it was just a civil war in 1971 between two factions of the Conservative movement. So in fact, we had unbroken Conservative government in Alberta for 70, 75 years. And at the time, particularly the Lougheed Progressive Conservatives, they really did live up to both sides of that name. It was a really, really big tent. And so if you can imagine Chrystia Freeland and Pierre Poilievre in the same party, that would have been the old Alberta PCs.
Right.
What we have now is not that. And, you know, one of the challenges we have politically is Albertans who are so used to voting for the Conservatives, they still call them the PCs, but they haven't been the PCs for a long time. You know, think that this still is the party of Lougheed or the party of Ralph Klein. Now, I knew both of those gentlemen, and I can tell you without question that Peter Lougheed would not recognize himself in the United Conservative Party, and I don't think Ralph Klein would either. And that is the real challenge for us politically, is to help folks understand that Danielle Smith's version of conservatism is not the pragmatic, thoughtful, socially oriented conservatism of the past. It's something really very different. It is a government that, and you know, I've been a political observer my whole life. I've been in public life for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this. It is a government that is fundamentally disinterested in actual governing. They don't actually care to fix anything or improve the healthcare system or improve the education system or improve the economy, because that actually hurts them politically. Her brand is, I fight with people. She never wins, but she fights. And so we jokingly in the House were saying, you know, she spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of Alberta taxpayer money on endorsing and supporting Pierre Poilievre in the last election. And we all said that should have been declared as a donation in kind to the Liberals, because every time she opened her mouth, she made it easier for Mark Carney. And she was, in fact, benched for the last 2 weeks, sent to Japan and Korea
Yep.
And she actually told on herself when she got back, when she was asked if she had a negative impact on Poilievre's fortunes. She said, he did much better in the last 2 weeks when I was out of the country. Um, but my point being that despite all of that, I think she secretly wanted Carney to win. Because if Poilievre had won, she would lose her raison d'etre. All she does is fight. And if she's got nothing to fight with, she would have had to find another target.
Right. Right. I want to go back though and start. We got sidetracked. I wasn't done talking about you a little bit because I'm
Oh,
in.
man. I'm one of those rare politicians who hates to talk about himself, but I can try.
Right. Try more because I'm fascinated by the fact that you seem very public minded from a young age, but not
Mm-hmm.
partisan.
Right.
So you get involved in nonprofits and community organizations, and then you get
Student
into
government. Yeah.
student government, and then you get into the nonpartisan world of municipal politics. So you had a really strong motivation to get involved in public life, but there's two things about it. One, it was local, not broader. And second of all, it was nonpartisan. So tell me a little bit about your thinking. And because I got involved young too, but I gravitated to a political party.
Yeah. So you can't see my socks right now, but they are purple because I wore purple every single day for the last 15 years. And the purple meaning red and blue. It doesn't just mean, centrist from a political perspective. It just invites people. It's an invitation to folks to say, let's set aside our ideology or our tribalism or our partisanship and let's focus on our common humanity, what brings us together. Now, my socks are orange and purple. More about that in a second. And by the way, those colors don't go together very well,
No, that's why they're
I'm kind of
socks.
stuck with it. Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm kind of stuck with it. But so you were talking about my best friend Chima, and he and I went in very different directions. He became more of a partisan. He was involved with the federal Liberal Party and so on. After that first little experience of partisan politics, went, I don't hate it. I get it, and I respect it, and I respect people who are in it. But for me, I was just always interested in how do we fix things? How do we find the best solution? And I'm crazy about cities. That's just always been my thing. If I have the chance to go on vacation, I don't go to a resort. I go to a big city and take the subway from the airport and try and figure out how it all works.
Yeah.
And in the end, being the mayor was a great job for me because it was about cities, but it was also focused on just find the best solution and fix things. And I had a city council that ran, if you believe in the left-right spectrum, I'm not sure I do these days, but it ran the gamut from Trump Party of Canada to, natural love will save us all. And yet we were able to do stuff. We were able to work together and build things. And I really appreciated that. And when I retired, I never, ever thought partisan politics were in my future. And people would say to me, do you want to get into provincial or federal politics? And I would say, what room is there for me in that? There's very little room for purple these days. And yet, here I am.
Well, our sponsor, CN, would like to offer a reminder that trade between Canada and the United States, recent events notwithstanding, is permanent and rock solid. That no matter the barriers, ingenuity and necessity take over and push through. Those are all clever similes, by the way. Bear with me. Until 144 years ago, goods traveling between Windsor and Detroit had to be unloaded and moved across the St. Clair River on barges. It was inefficient and slow and costly. Michigan and Ontario needed a tunnel, but the soil beneath the river was soft blue clay. Tunneling until then had proved impossible. Then came a brilliant engineer, Joseph Hobson of Guelph. Basically, he adapted a solution first used under the Thames in England a few decades earlier. He and his team used hydraulic rams to force two iron shells under the St. Clair, an hour upriver from Windsor, keeping workers safe while they performed the back-breaking work for 17 cents an hour of excavating millions of tons of wet clay. It required compressed air and even the creation of airlocks, but they did it. The iron shells eventually met mid-river, only a quarter inch out of alignment. In April 1881, Engine 253 made the first trip through the St. Clair Tunnel, traveling nearly 2 kilometers under the riverbed. The engineering achievement made headlines around the world. A century later, the tunnel was deemed insufficient. Trains had gotten bigger. So CN built another one, 30 meters away. It was dug from the Canadian to the American side using a boring machine nicknamed Excalibur. Today, 30 years after the second tunnel opened, CN offers congratulations to Prime Minister Mark Carney on his election win and asks that he keep the spirit of those massive tunneling projects in mind as he sets about renegotiating Canada's trade agreement with the United States. Will, determination, improvisation, and ingenuity can overcome just about anything. Did purple represent your own views, or did purple represent what you thought was out there? Because there is no orange in that. That's red and blue.
Yeah. Yeah. I tried to figure out what red plus blue plus orange was, and it turns into brown. So I have that too. But yeah, no. The the idea behind it was not so much red and blue equals liberal plus conservative. It was more the purple is something different and something new where we can all find a place for ourselves. And so that was really always the idea. And that is me, right? I worked at McKinsey. I come from the business world. I know how to work around a budget. I know how dollars work, and I believe in low taxes. But at the same time, I also deeply understand the importance of great public services to help people thrive. And I also firmly believe that you don't have a strong economy unless you have strong public services and healthy people. So for me, that was one of the reasons I always shied away a little bit from partisanship. And remember that I had six premiers from three different political parties and two prime ministers from two different political parties while I was mayor.
Yeah.
And it was important for me to be able to work with all of them. And so I'm as surprised as anybody to find myself nowadays in partisan politics. And you didn't ask the question, but I'll answer it anyway. Twofold reason. Number one is if you want to play the game, you got to play the game by the rules that exist. And the second was that there was really no pull for me saying, oh, I love being a politician. I need to get back in politics. I was having a great retirement. I was having a David Herle style retirement where I could just pontificate on things without taking any responsibility. But when I looked at what was going on with my province, when I looked at, frankly, the significant danger that Danielle Smith and the UCP posed for the average Albertan, I thought to myself, is there a way for me to get more involved? And I famously said to myself just about a year and 4 months ago, somebody's got to do something. And I went out looking for that somebody. And as I talked to people across the province saying, are you going to do it? Who should do it? Who do you have faith in? So many fingers turned back to me.
Oh, this is the Dick Cheney selection committee.
Yeah, kind of is.
Yeah.
I don't know if I love that particular reference, but remember, no one had asked me to do this. I was just being a busybody, right? Trying to figure out who I could support and what I wanted to do. But the interesting thing about that is when people said you should, Rachel Notley is stepping down, you should run for the leadership of the NDP. I said, first of all, partisan politics. Second of all, the NDP. And so I started talking to party members and just saying, I realized after my very first interview that I was asking a horrifically misguided question. And that question was, do you guys want to be ideologically pure or do you want to win? And what I realized very, very quickly was that the Alberta New Democrats had evolved long past that and fully understood that in order for us to build a better community, we have to be a viable political entity. And we've got to actually be able to win, not just on a vote split that Rachel Notley did in 2015, but to build a sustained political movement that really reflects where the median Albertan is. And so some people thought, oh my gosh, I'm coming in. It's some sort of a takeover. We're going to turn it into a centrist party. The thing is, it was already there. Rachel Notley had already done all that work. And indeed, I really believed and continue to believe that the Alberta New Democrats really do reflect the median Alberta voter. You know, the person who wants decent public services to be there when they need them, who wants a place that is welcoming and focused on the dignity of everybody, where workers have the right to go to work safely and come home alive and safe with money in their pockets every day, and where taxes aren't too high, and where we have a government that knows how to run a budget and doesn't waste money. And to me, I was like, well, wait, that's me. And I realized that I actually really did have a partisan political home, and here we are.
Right. So, um, just one last thing about you, though, before we come back to that. What were your extracurricular activities when you were in high school?
What weren't they? As you can tell, I am a natural born athlete. No, that is not true at all. But I did everything else. I loved high school. I wanted one of those weird teenagers who really enjoyed high school, and so I was in student government. I played Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I did a bunch of debating and public speaking, and I was kind of big man on campus, not just because I was big, but just a couple weeks ago, I was at the Alberta Provincial Debating Championships. I was handing out the trophies, and I picked up this one really awkward trophy, and I turned it over and turned it around, and in front of all the students, went, "Yep, name's still on it." And and then I told them I'll told them what I'll tell you now, which is I always tell young people to get into debating and public speaking, not just because it helps you be a good public speaker, which I think is an important skill. But the most important reason I tell young people to do it is because when you're debating, you have to prepare both sides.
Right.
And in the world that we live in right now, the ability to look at the other side is missing. And I think that that basic rule of life to be able to understand the other side, whether or not you disagree with it, whether or not you have empathy for it, is really, really important. And I think that's massively lacking in politics today.
Okay. Do you like Teams?
Microsoft Teams, no, I have a hate with it. We never get our meetings done
Do you
properly.
like being on Teams, or do you like doing things by yourself?
Well, even as mayor, I couldn't do it by myself. That's what people never understood, is that the mayor has very little power. There's no executive authority. You are a member of city council, and in
It's
the case of
crazy,
Calgary,
really.
there's 15 members. Yeah, there's no such thing as a strong mayor system. Even in Ontario, where Doug Ford talks about a strong mayor system, there really isn't one. You're a member of city council, and if you can't get 7 people to agree with you, then you can't get anything done. And I approach this very differently. Sort of previous mayors in most cities kind of have a hidden invisible party, if you like. They
Right.
know there's votes they can count on, and they don't really care, often don't care about the others. In my world, I went looking for 8 votes on every single issue. I'll admit that after towards the very end during the pandemic, I just didn't have time for that. And then at that point, for the first time, I was like, guys, this is right, and this is how we should vote. But for most of the time, for the decade or so, I had to go and find, if not consensus, something that people could live with. And I really loved doing that. And I've got this really wonderful group of MLAs now, largest opposition in Alberta's history. And they really do have a lot of ideological differences, very different in background. And yes, as the leader, I can say, this is what we're doing. But I generally start by saying, let me tell you what I think, and you tell me what you think, and let's see how we do. And I actually really enjoy that. What's frustrating to me about partisan politics is that the other side doesn't care, right? So even if we were to say to them, look, this piece of legislation is fundamentally flawed. If you make these small amendments, then we can support it and it's going to be better for everybody. And they look at us and go, yeah, we have a majority. It doesn't matter. And that's been really hard for me to adjust to.
Right. Right. Because in the city, it would be different. In the city, there would be more give and take.
Yeah, you don't want an 8-7 vote on everything. You know, you want to bring people along, and the vast majority of our votes in that realm in municipal government, the vast majority were unanimous. Towards the end, when people really wanted to run for mayor, we had a bunch of 13-2 and 14-1 votes. But beyond that, finding that consensus and kind of saying, I don't care if you're right wing or left wing or however you define yourself, let's do what's right for the people was a really, I don't want to make it sound too utopian. We fought all the time. And sometimes our council meetings were no fun. But in the end, everyone was there because they wanted to do the best by the people. and everyone was susceptible to persuasion most of the time.
Our sponsor, TikTok Canada, has a team of local employees committed to supporting the success of Canadian content creators. Take, for example, the TikTok Accelerator for Indigenous Creators, a free program run for the past 4 years with the National Screen Institute. It empowers Indigenous creators with the essential skills needed for a thriving digital career. Alumni of the Accelerator program include Kamloops' Ashley Michelle, owner of Four Generations Creations, who went on to open a storefront for her small businesses, and North Bay's Vanessa Brousseau, who uses her TikTok account to advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. Unfortunately, the previous federal government has ordered TikTok to shut down its Canadian operations, eliminating its Canadian offices and jobs, including those employees responsible for programs like the Indigenous Accelerator. With a new government in Ottawa, there is an opportunity to pursue a balanced path, one that keeps local teams in place to support the success of Canadians while addressing security concerns and fostering a thriving tech sector. Shutting down TikTok Canada eliminates hundreds of well-paying local jobs and investments. Let's find a solution for TikTok that makes sense for the more than 14 million monthly Canadian users on TikTok, including creators, small businesses, and advertisers. Let's move on to this UCP government that you have there. Um, who's the most important person in that party, Danielle Smith or this Parker fellow?
He's a bit out now. David Parker is who you're talking about from Take
Yeah.
Back Alberta. He's sort of on the outs with the premier at the moment. So the right answer, the right question to ask, I would argue, is who's the most important person, the premier or her chief of staff?
Oh,
And her chief of staff is a guy called Rob Anderson, who is an author of the Free Alberta Strategy. And basically, the two of them are operating this very reckless, very dangerous world where, again, there's no interest in actual governing. They're just interested in scoring political points and remaining in power. To which I always think, why do you want to be in power if there's nothing you want to do with that power other than remain in power?
right.
To me, it just doesn't make much sense. And so every single thing they do is just to make their base happy. And right now, the most dangerous part of this is this flirtation with separatism, which is reckless and could tear our country apart.
Is it a flirtation though? Like, and the reason I asked the question, just to come back for maybe my listeners, is I'm watching a party that I think is very radical, um, and has a very radical wing to it, and is powerful through Jason Kenney out of office, when he was premier, and for for diverging from the ideological straight line. So I'm wondering, just as an observer, whether Danielle Smith is a separatist or whether her party is controlled by separatists.
Does it matter?
Kind of.
Because we have the same debate in the office every single day, and the argument that I make is I don't know. I don't know if she's a separatist, but if she acts like one and she is playing with fire that she does not know how to control. So I'll give you an example. I happened to be in the room when the then Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, made a speech saying there would be a referendum on withdrawing from the European Union.
Yeah.
There were a lot of very, very important people in that room. And he made it very clear that he didn't think this was going anywhere, but he thought the threat of a referendum would help him extract a better deal from Brussels. And he didn't say this out loud, but reading between the lines, it was very clear that he also felt that going towards this referendum would shut up the extremists in his party. It was very clear. And we know what happened. And you look at Danielle Smith right now, and she's following the exact same playbook. And I'm very worried we're going to have the exact same results, because if you're stoking anger and division and fear whether it's rational or not, but you're making people mad, you are going to not be able to control the results. And so I want all of Canada, because of course all of Canada is on the Herle Burly. I want all of Canada to recognize what an existential threat this is to our economic and social well-being and to our entire country. Do not think this is a bunch of cranks in Alberta being cranky. It's terrible politics. It's terrible economic policy, but it is very real. And when we look back at Brexit, when we look at the Scottish referendum, when we look at 1995 in Canada, we recognize that the folks who are the Remainers, if you like, the folks who believed in the concept of the thing, were way too complacent. That we thought, oh, these are just a bunch of cranks, nothing's going to come of this, it's fine. And
Yeah.
I'm telling all Canadians right now, let's not be complacent. We got to stand up for this messy place. You know, we have a lot of legitimate concerns in Alberta with the way this country runs, and they are legitimate. Yes, it's true that the equalization formula is unfair and it's stacked. Yes, it's true that it's much too difficult for us to be able to get our products to market. And it is absolutely true that conservatives have built a grand total of 0 miles of pipeline to Tidewater in the last 40 years. And it took Rachel Notley and the federal government and an able assist from the then Mayor of Calgary to get the Trans Mountain expansion built, which at this moment is one of the few things keeping the Canadian economy out of recession, that 136-inch pipeline.
Hmm.
And so absolutely there's stuff we got to work on. But you know what? When my parents came to this country, they didn't know a thing about Canada. They just kind of knew somewhere deep in their bones that this would be a better place to raise their kids. And this country is messy and chaotic, and we squabble, and we are bruised in many ways, and we're scrappy, and we fight, and we got to make things better, and we are far from perfect. And we have tons of work to do to make sure that every single person sharing this land, from Indigenous peoples to newcomers, has the ability to thrive here. We have a lot of work to do. But Canada is not broken. This experiment that we've built in this country is one of the greatest experiments we've ever seen in humanity. And as I've been saying lately, I'll be damned if I'm going to let Danielle Smith tear that down for political gain. But I think all of us as Canadians need to stand up for what this country is and what the promise of this country is. And we need to do it quickly. More than just slogans, more than just elbows up, but actually proving that we can work together and build this nation, but never, ever giving up on the idea of it.
So that's beautiful. And that really rings with me. But that's emotional. And more rationally, sometimes I think about things this way. Sometimes I go, Alberta is sitting on a pot of gold,
Mm-hmm.
and gold, let's say in this imaginary world, that gold is only going to be valuable for another 30 or 40 years. And I'm an Albertan, and I go, well, I want to extract as much value out of this gold as I can, as long as I can. But we're governed by people that have a bunch of other interests in addition to that, that may or may not result in us maximizing the value of our gold. So I can see rationally how an Albertan might want Albertans making the oil and gas decisions rather than federal liberals.
Well, you know, it's like you're quoting from one of my speeches that I made when I was mayor of Calgary, because that was sort of the message that I was trying to bring out nationally across the country, even in my broken French in Quebec, which is, look, that pot of gold, I'm going to say two things, one of which will sound very political. That pot of gold is something that brings wealth, not just to Alberta, but to all of us. And no country should be foolish enough to say, I'm going to take my pot of gold and I'm only going to have one customer who can buy it at a discount and it's non-renewable, and I'm going to sell it at a discount to the world price and not get the full value out of it until it's all gone. I don't think there's anybody who thinks that, as you say, oil and gas will remain to power the world forever and ever. There are many, many differences of opinion on how long, but it's a good long time that we're still going to need this stuff. And, you know, it's very popular in Alberta to say, we want the last barrel of oil burned in the world to be a barrel of good Alberta oil. Absolutely, we do. That is exactly right. But we have to earn that right. And, is a barrel of Alberta oil different in some way than a barrel of Norwegian oil? We're not just talking about Venezuela and Saudi Arabia here.
Yeah.
And so we have to be very thoughtful in how we do that. But I agree with that. I think we maximize the value of what we have. And importantly, we save the money for the day when we don't have it anymore,
Right.
which federal and provincial governments in this country have been very poor at saving the money and investing it for the future. But I'll say one other thing. There is a more important pot of gold. The pot of gold is not just what's beneath our feet, it's what's between our ears. And so the real value is the innovative people and how we look after one another and how we work on one another and build how we build wealth from that resource sector. I once took a class at Harvard Business School, and I was sitting in the back of the room, and the professor was talking about the energy, what was it called? The energy paradox, something like that, how resource rich nations tend to impoverish themselves. And this American professor said, I can only think of one place where they got it right. And it's because it was a Harvard Business School grad who was running the place. And he was talking about Peter Naheed.
Right.
And I stuck up my hand and went, it's more complicated than that. And then I learned you're not supposed to question your professors if you're in a class at Harvard Business School. But in any case, it's not wrong. And hanging on to that legacy, I think, is really an important part of what we need to do together. And it is absolutely true that we in Alberta legitimately go, do you understand how much wealth this brings the entire country? Do you understand that you will never, ever balance the federal budget unless the Alberta economy is running on all cylinders? Do you understand how much jobs across the country depend on Canadian energy, much of which comes from Alberta? And it is endlessly
Our
frustrating.
exchange rate.
Yeah. It's
Right.
endlessly frustrating to Albertans that people take us for granted in that way. I'll give you an example, which is when our economy was really suffering in 2015, 2016 timeframe after the price of oil went down. I remember meeting with very, very senior officials in the federal government at the time. And I said, listen, there's one thing I need from you. Price of housing in Toronto is out of control. Toronto is full. Vancouver is full. Montreal, in many ways, is also full. So you've got this network of trade representatives around the world who bring investment in, right? For 1 year, can you focus only on Calgary and Edmonton? Can you work with only Calgary and Edmonton companies and sell the world to come here? Because I've got vacant office space, I've got affordable housing, and we're in really bad economic strains. And really, they just couldn't get it. And you remember there was a big thing where we wanted to bring Amazon's second headquarters, or Google wanted to come, and the federal government was out there selling Toronto or selling Montreal, which is great. They're wonderful cities and they deserve it. But, at some points, those who live in Toronto would say it's kind of full.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yet we were just never
build a new
able
road
to
before you
see
bring anybody else. Yeah.
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 And we were just never able to break through the federal government consciousness to understand that investments outside of that corridor are investments that make sense for the whole nation.
Right.
And by the way,
Well,
that was with the Conservative government and with the Liberal government.
Herle Burly-ites, let's take a brief minute to talk about minutes. Heritage minutes, to be precise. You probably already know them. Do you smell burnt toast, for example? But there are a few things you may not know about these true stories of great Canadians, their challenges and achievements. First, they're always and only produced by Historica Canada, the charitable organization that also operates the Canadian Encyclopedia, the Memory Project, and other programs. There are more than 100 minutes, all offered in English and French, and for free. Each 60-second story takes up to 9 months to produce. That's because every detail, including dialogue, is carefully researched to ensure historical accuracy. The minutes are all about Canada, but their fan base extends to countries around the world, including the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia. You can subscribe to Historica Canada's YouTube channel to be alerted when new minutes launch, or join the more than 500,000 subscribers following Historica on TikTok, Facebook, X, Insta, wherever you get your information. The new one, out May 6th, tells the story of Bora Laskin, the first Jewish Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and someone whose reforms benefited all Canadians. Watch it. Heritage Minutes, a part of our heritage, brought to you by Historica Canada. So get some advice on the table here for the government. I'm going to set the table this way. I think that it is incredibly important to reach out to Alberta and Saskatchewan right now from the federal government and make people feel like this is going to be a government for everybody, that it's going to be their government as well as Ontario and Quebec's government and Vancouver's government. I do not see really the Smith government as a constructive partner in that reach out exercise.
They are not.
And so I think that the reach out to Alberta has to go around the government. So if you were advising the new prime minister and his government, what are those legitimate grievances in Alberta that need to get addressed?
Yeah, I remember the last time that the federal government tried to do this, we ended up in something called the sponsorship scandal.
Yeah.
So, Via Rail ads at the Calgary Saddle Dome, when Via Rail doesn't go to Calgary, that's not going to help. But you're very right. Not only is the Danielle Smith government not a constructive government, they will try to destroy any element to do that. And so I want to be very clear here. If we get new pipelines built, if we are able to address many of Alberta's legitimate concerns, that will not actually help the Liberals politically here. Not very much anyway. And the provincial government will continue to pretend that nothing has happened. The federal Liberal government did, in fact, get a pipeline built and receive very little political benefit for it. So the point that I'm trying to make here is do it because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's the right thing for Canada. It's the right thing for Alberta, certainly, but it's the right thing for all of us. It's the right thing economically. It's the right thing environmentally to reach out and do these nation building projects. Just don't expect you're going to get huge political benefit for it. Do it because it's the right thing to do. And my job in Alberta is to ensure that this destructive government is not able to destroy even more.
Right. So beyond pipelines, what is it? What does Alberta need out of the federal government?
It is time for us to acknowledge, for example, the inherent unfairness of how equalization works. Now, it's very clear that Premier Smith doesn't understand how equalization works because she said some rather nonsensical things this week about it. But it is legitimate for Albertans to ask.
Let's be clear about what isn't. It isn't. It isn't Alberta cutting a check to Quebec.
Exactly.
It is not Alberta cutting a check to Quebec. It is federal money, right? That happens to come in disproportionate amounts from Alberta because Alberta is more prosperous and Albertans are more prosperous. So they're paying a higher share of tax. So that's a transfer, if you will, but a pretty indirect one, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't, because there is a formula, right? Yeah. If it were just the federal government making decisions about where they want to invest, that would be one thing. But we know very well that increases to federal transfer payments to certain jurisdictions have led to lowering of taxes in those jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And those are the sorts of things that irritate Albertans, right? And it is extremely fair to say that we treat electricity very differently than we treat oil and gas in the formula that determines how much money you get. And it's quite obvious why that is the case.
Right.
And so,
to
as
protect Quebec, we don't have to be shy on this. It's to protect Quebec, right?
As the Premier said the other day, Albertans have no problem looking after poor provinces, right? But if they look at the federal government supporting wealthy provinces to the extent that we don't get that kind of support, that's what irritates people. Everybody knows that even if you fix equalization, it doesn't mean our taxes are going down. It doesn't mean it's going to change, the way that our life works, but our federal taxes are going down, I should say. But we understand that it's just a symbolic thing about who matters, right? And what matters. There are a number of things to do in the energy sector as well. As you say, pipelines are important. But more, it's about the ability to show we know how to build hard things here, hard, complicated things. So, after the floods of 2013, it took close to a decade, not under Bill C-69, under the previous Environmental Assessment Act. It took over nearly a decade, and the dam's still not done, for us to be able to get through the federal environmental assessment to build a dam to protect downtown Calgary from flooding. And, this is something that has driven me crazy for years. We have to be able to, as a country, just say we can get stuff done. I'll tell you a little bit of detail on that dam, the Springbank Dry Dam, which is the federal regulators would keep coming back with questions that were sort of just, we'd be interested to know this. So one of the questions is, what would happen to the trout population in the Elbow River should this dam be activated in the event of a 1 in 100-year flood? The answer is they would die. But it's not an endangered species, and they would come back the next year. Why do you need to know that? Why are you making me do unbelievable analysis of trout populations in different scenarios when that should never make your decision yes or no, we're going to allow this thing to be built? We sort of allowed the bureaucrats to sort of be fanciful and say, I'm interested in this, right? Instead of really focusing it in a business-like way, saying, what will prevent you from making this decision? What will make you change your vote from a yes to a no, or vice versa? And so things like that, the waste, right, throughout the system, and the fact that it just gives people the sense that we can't get stuff done is really important. Another example, and I know that I'm not that far different than Premier Smith on a few of these items, but another one of those is the clean electricity regulation. There is a huge benefit in building out a net zero grid while we increasingly electrify our economy. But it is also true that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and I always forget which one of Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, have a very, very different grid than everywhere else in the country. So to create one rule that goes across everyone, which leads to tens of billions of dollars of investment in one jurisdiction and zero investment in the other jurisdiction, doesn't fulfill us with confidence that this government really understands how we move forward to the common goal of the net zero electrical grid, because it doesn't have to be by penalizing one jurisdiction over another.
Well, wait,
And these are the
I live in
things where we're
Ontario
really
these
looking
days.
for this.
I live in Ontario these days, boss. And, you know, I hear people from Alberta and Saskatchewan say, well, it would be too expensive to get off of coal. But Ontario got off of coal and replaced it
Oh,
with
well,
nuclear. And you know what? Governments paid, a government I worked for, a great government, Kathleen Wynne, paid with her job for high electricity prices because of getting off of coal, because it's cheap. If you're going to get off of coal, you're going to pay more for electricity. And some jurisdictions have done
so
that and others don't want to,
so we are off of coal in Alberta. That may surprise your listeners.
right?
The last coal plant was retired last year. The difference is, what do we replace it with? So in the case of Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, you have, it's not just nuclear, you have abundant hydroelectric power to supply the baseline. We don't have that. And so our baseline has to be renewables plus storage plus natural gas. And that's the challenge with the clean electricity regulation. We need natural gas as a backstop because we don't have the hydro to be the backstop. However, the clean electricity regulation ignores that and basically means that we'd have to build a whole whack of nuclear as the only way to fill that baseload. And that may or may not make sense in this context because it's multiple times more expensive than combined cycle turbines that of natural gas that actually are not nearly as polluting as coal. And is that the interim until we get to utility grade battery power? Did I mention I used to own an electric utility? I can go on about this forever, but that's kind of the point, right? And there are ways in which to do this where maybe it costs you a year or two, but maybe it saves the economy $100 billion. And if we can figure out how to do that as technology catches up to our aspirations, it just makes more sense to do it that way. And the former federal minister of environment just was not particularly helpful at being pragmatic. Is that a nice way of putting it?
Nicer than Corey is.
Yeah.
um, so are you generally of the view, which has been expressed to me by most people from the prairies, to be honest, that we really ought not to be so focused on Canadian emissions, that we really ought to be focused on global emission reduction? And, the kind of what you're talking about, if we give up a year or 2 years in the transition of our electricity grid, what's the big deal?
I do believe that. Now, to be clear, um, it is absolutely true that if you look at it from a logical perspective, helping large economies in Asia get off coal has more impact than transitioning off natural gas in Canada in terms of global emissions. Now, of course, we don't get any credit for that in global treaties, right?
Right.
That credit will go immediately to the receiving country. And so there's a lot of arguments to be made saying that's sort of it's sort of a false argument to make. But I just believe we want to do what's best for the planet. And that means looking beyond our borders. And so that's one of the reasons why natural gas pipelines are so important, why LNG is so important, because it will help reduce global emissions in a more holistic way than we've seen before. But that said, that doesn't mean we don't do anything at home. We don't use it as an excuse. I really, really believe that Canada should be able to show the world the example of a community, a country that is very committed to producing resources. That's where our wealth comes from, but also is a global leader in the fight against climate. I don't think that's a pipe dream to say that. I think we're smart and we're innovative, and we are able to do both.
Right. Okay, let's spring forward to an election, which could happen anytime uh,
Maybe.
in Alberta. Um, Let me first give you a chance to opine on this. You sounded to me like you and your colleagues in the NDP in Alberta view yourselves as a centrist or center-left coalition um, of folks that are practical more than you're ideological. Um, that is that is not necessarily the way that people all across the country see the NDP as a brand. Um, or do you have to do some work for Albertans to see the NDP as that brand, or did Rachel Notley do that work already? Or where are you at in terms of carrying around a brand, frankly, that's freighted with a lot of history, um,
Yeah.
and trying to position it into this particular political context?
Well, let me start just by, like Jason Kenney used to do, rejecting your assumption a little bit.
Okay.
Um, which is I don't
I
like
think he
use
learned that
terms
from
like
Herb
center.
Gray in the House of Commons, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I don't like using terms like centrist or center left because, quite frankly, I think those words are meaningless to the average citizen. I always used to say, you ask the average citizen to define left wing or right wing, 7 out of 10 will look at you like they have no idea what you're talking about. Two will get it wrong, and the third one will be a journalist or a political science student. So what I really believe in is smart, rational, pragmatic government that delivers the services that people need at a reasonable cost. Simple as that. But you're absolutely right. You know, the Alberta NDP has been, or Alberta's New Democrats, as I prefer to say, has been policy independent of the federal party forever. We're financially independent of the federal party. And this past weekend at our provincial convention, we actually made it so that if you are a member of the provincial party, you're not automatically a member of the federal party, and that passed unanimously.
right.
But certainly the brand carries baggage across the country. But here on the prairies, you know, I always remind folks that the first premier in the modern era to balance the budget was Gary Doer, NDP premier of Manitoba. The second was Roy Romano, NDP premier in Saskatchewan. And this is hard to say, but pragmatic, very populist premiers have often come from the NDP. And here on the prairies, New Democrats have always shown themselves to be better with money than conservatives. And I think that's the argument we have to make. You know, I'm here in Winnipeg talking to some union folks, and I gave a very sort of pro economy message. And I said, it may sound not like a New Democrat to say this, but the party of workers is, always has been, and always will be the party of jobs. And so we have to be able to come forward with a very strong economic message and a strong fiscal discipline message. And we have to not just say it, but live it. That's my track record as the mayor of Calgary, right? We were named the third best city in the world to live in. We invested heavily in things that made a difference to people. We also had the lowest residential property taxes in the country. And so it's not an impossible thing to do. And it's what we really have to be able to tell people.
I wonder though, there's so many people in Alberta who have their roots in Saskatchewan. And so many of those people may have
I'm
left
sitting next to
Saskatchewan.
I'm sitting next to one of them right now.
Right. I mean, half of my family moved from Saskatchewan to Alberta, and in many cases, they moved for opportunity. And they did not see the Saskatchewan, which was being led by NDP governments at the time, as a land of opportunity. In fact, Saskatchewan in those days was an equalization receiving province.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wonder whether, even leaving Jagmeet Singh and the federal NDP aside, whether a lot of Albertans don't have some negative connotation of NDP that goes back to Alan Blakeney, for God's sake, and buying
When
pot
I
ads.
was ma- when I was mayor of Calgary, there was only one place that I was forbidden to go, and that was McMahon Stadium when there was a Stamps Riders game
Yeah,
because the green would outnumber the red.
yeah,
Uh, but
absolutely.
that's but that said, we have been lucky enough to welcome people from every corner of this province, of the country, of the world, to Alberta. And one of the things that makes Alberta special, which I've said for a long time, is that in Alberta, nobody really cares who your daddy was or where you went to school or your lineage or how you worship or whom you love. What we care about is what you bring to the table and your good ideas and whether you're going to do well here. And that's one of the really special things that creates an entrepreneurial and innovative world. It's very freeing for people. So yes, it is true that some people bring their baggage with them, but I think for most Albertans, they just want to do what's right for Alberta. So I'm not naive about this. Obviously, there is a brand that I have to overcome. I have to have people look at my track record in Calgary uh, and understand what is possible. But one of the things that today's politics is really about is this politics of division is also a politics of things will never be better than they are today. And we have to settle for what we've got because those people, whoever those people are going to take it away. That's mostly true on the right, but even on the progressive side of the spectrum, we're not innocent of this kind of politics of divisiveness and division that doesn't allow you to dream
No,
big.
it's what lack of economic growth
And
does. You start to fight over allocation. Right?
that's right. And it's an abundance problem. And even in a place like Alberta, where we've had a ton of economic growth, we still are falling into the scarcity mindset. But here's the thing, you grew up on the prairies. So you know that on a nice spring day like today, you look up and you can't see the horizon. And what I always say is that it is impossible to have small dreams when you live under a sky that big. And that is what my job is, to remind Albertans that we don't have to settle for what the UCP gives us. We don't have to settle for a substandard healthcare system and a substandard education system. We don't have to settle for workers being disrespected. And we don't have to settle for a premier who's out of touch, even with the oil and gas industry that she claims to champion. We can do better. We can have better and we can be better. And that note is a hard note in politics these days, but it's one that I think is critical for people to hear.
So you start to get into it there. What is the case for replacing her? I mean, these issues that we've talked about, these big national issues, I'm sure they have a role. But in my experience with provincial elections, it's more likely to revolve around access to doctors and ERs and the
Mm-hmm.
conditions in classrooms and the conditions of the road system, etc. Like, what is the case in Alberta for defeating Danielle Smith?
Well, look, a million Albertans don't have a family doctor. Emergency rooms are in rural parts of Alberta are as likely to be closed as they are to be open. When you are lucky enough to get to an emergency room, you could be looking at a 15 to 20 hour wait. We have a measles outbreak here, which is not in the least caused by the fact that we've got a government that until this week could not utter the words, get your child immunized.
Right.
So certainly the healthcare system has gone beyond being at the point of collapse to, in many communities, having collapsed. Our classrooms are larger and larger and more complex. Teachers are more and more frazzled. Students are getting less of a great education. The cost of living is very much on people's mind. For too many of our neighbors, a trip to the grocery store is an exercise in fear. And being able to get to the end of the month whole sometimes is an impossible dream. This is what's going on. Our unemployment rate is climbing faster than anywhere in the country. Our inflation is well above the national average. Our auto insurance is way more than the highest in the
Always
country.
has been. When I got my driver's license in Saskatchewan, kids in Alberta of my age couldn't afford to drive.
Yeah, and it's worse now. Yeah. And so, all of these things, all these bread and butter issues are what we need to remind people that better is possible. What Danielle Smith has done masterfully is sort of told people that's as good as it's ever going to get. But in the meantime, we have to fight with Ottawa. And right now she's changing the channel to talk about separatism. And, we are going to talk about nothing but separatism for the next year until that referendum happens. And so it's critical for me as a politician, but also for Albertans as a whole to go, hey, this is just not good enough. Oh, right. By the way, I should have added that they're also the most corrupt and unethical government I've ever seen in history. And the amount of grift and insider trading is shocking. Even to an Ontarian, I will tell you, it is shocking the amount that we're seeing here. And they just don't know what they're doing. They make mistakes all the time. We have a premier who regularly stands up in the House and says, oh, I didn't read that report. Oh, I don't know about that. And the most recent, which is fun, is we're in the middle of a massive healthcare scandal, bloated contracts, cronyism, people getting fired. And the most recent piece that came out is that the figure at the center of the scandal, someone who, despite no experience in healthcare, has received hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts from the provincial government, happens to be the cousin of the Justice Minister's wife. And when the Premier was asked, did she know it? Did he recuse himself from the decisions? She said, I just found out right now. Do you want to divorce his wife? Is that a real connection?
I'm not even sure I know the names of those people.
Oh, well, it's easy to find. But yeah, she literally said...
No, but what I'm saying is, is that a real connection? Your Justice Minister's wife's cousin.
Justice Minister's wife's cousin. So I just call him Cousin Sam now. But yeah, the Premier literally said, I didn't know that until I learned about it on the floor of the House right now. And then when she was asked, isn't it relevant to you that the Justice Minister is related to the person you've given all this money to? She said, do you want him to divorce his wife?
Right.
And I just thought, no, but how about we don't give hundreds of millions of dollars to a relative of a cabinet minister, or at least he recuses himself from those decisions. And at least the Premier knows that she's doing this.
Right. Okay.
So it is a real pleasure talking to you, David, but I see the people of Winnipeg are clamoring for me here.
Do you have to go? I had one quick question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Healthcare, money or reform or both?
Three things. Money, thoughtful reform, not reform for reform's sake, respect for the people who work in the system. The challenge we have in Alberta is that there's probably not enough money, that the reform is catastrophic and taking money away from the front lines because it's completely ideologically driven, but it's all based on a contempt that the government has for the people that do the work. And the only thing that's keeping the healthcare system going right now is the hard work, determination, and sweat of the frontline healthcare workers. And if you start with respect for them and their expertise and how we can do things better, then that's the basis on which reform can happen.
Naheed, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. What a pleasure. I hope we'll get a chance to do it again.
Yeah, it's great. I really appreciate your time. Go wow the people of Winnipeg and then get back to Alberta as quick as you can. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsors, CN, TikTok Canada, and Historica Canada, and all the Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened. And you could have gone, but you stayed. So thank you again very much.
Thank you.
The leader of the NDP and the official opposition in Alberta, Mr. Nenshi. Take care.